Today we're going to talk about environmental activism. This is our last screencast for this unit, so make sure that if you have any questions that you're asking in class, that's one of the benefits of using this style, is that we should have more time to answer any type of questions, whether it be on this topic or topics that we've done in the past. So make sure you're taking advantage of that. The learning target for this screencast is to explain the impact that the Silent Spring has, which is a book that was published. We'll talk about that here in a few minutes. And also why nuclear power plants were created during the 1970s. You may or may not have seen these huge cooling towers of nuclear power plants, but there are about 100 or so power plants in the United States. We'll talk about why they were created and some of the effects that it's had on our society. We're going to start by talking about some of the roots in environmentalism. So in 1962, a woman named Rachel Carson published a book called The Silent Spring. You can see her picture up in the left-hand corner. She went to college. She wasn't really sure what she wanted to do when she got there. She enjoyed writing, and she also found that she was very fascinated with biology. So she put both of these two together, and eventually she would write a book called The Silent Spring. In it, she warned against the growing use of pesticides and also some other insecticides too. One of the insecticides, and one of the most famous ones, is DDT. What DDT does is it kills insects, but she found that it also had a negative impact on the rest of the environment too, in particular birds. Because when birds were trying to reproduce, their eggs would be very leathery if they were exposed to a lot of DDT. This made it so that their babies wouldn't survive very long. So in her book, she argued that not only did different pesticides poison the very food that they were supposed to protect, it also had a negative impact on animal life as well. So the basis of her book, and the reason why it was called Silent Spring, was because there wouldn't be any birds after a while if we kept on using these types of pesticides or insecticides. Now, not everybody is going to respond well to this book because a lot of the pesticide or insecticide companies are going to feel threatened by this book. But a lot of people, and the major effect that it had was that it showed some of the damaging effects of industrial growth. And it was really the first warning to what needed to happen in order to improve our environment. Some environmental concerns of the 1970s. First of all, before we get started on it, you can just see the definition of what environmentalism is, and it's just taking an active role in the protection of the environment. So it's the first time in the 1970s that there is an Earth Day. You can see it was celebrated for the first time on April 22nd, 1970, and Earth Day is just basically, maybe you are familiar with it, maybe not, supporting the environment and some friendly policies towards the Earth. The government is also going to take action in the 1970s in order to stop pollution and other types of activities that were occurring that were causing harm to the environment. And also it's going to be the first time where the Environmental Protection Agency is created. It was combined from 15 other programs that existed to stop pollution in the past. Still an agency that exists today in order to protect the environment. Somewhat a controversial agency because it does make it a little bit more tough on businesses because it makes them go through different processes to make sure that their businesses aren't hurting the environment, but most people would say that it's helpful to society. The next topic that we're going to address is some of the things that the government did in order to help the environment. One of them was the Clean Air Act, which gave the government authority to set air standards. This was something that was enforced by the EPA. It also passed the Endangered Species Act in 1973. What this Endangered Species Act did was it protected the environment, or protected the different habitats of animals that were endangered. And you can see the cartoon on the right, and it says those opposed to extending the Endangered Species Act. And you can see somebody who might have been a logger and other businessmen because it protected these habitats from being developed so people couldn't make money there. But it also shows those in favor and you can see some wings and paws of the different animals that may have been endangered. So it's all about protecting the habitat of these animals. There are also laws that were passed to limit pesticides, like we've already talked about, like DDT, and also strip mining. And what strip mining is it creates a huge hole in the earth, and it doesn't necessarily have to be refilled or anything, so it's another damaging type of effect that it has on the environment. But it, again, is controversial because strip mining provided jobs. Because of some of the energy problems that we talked about and foreign reliance on oil, a new type of energy was created and produced in the 1970s, and that was nuclear energy. We're not going to get into too many of the specifics of how nuclear energy is produced, but it was an attractive alternative to oil and some of the dependence that we had on foreign oil. As you can see, some opponents feared the impact that might have on the environment, especially if there would be a nuclear meltdown, which eventually was going to happen in Russia. And there was a major scare in the 1970s on 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. So a lot of nuclear types of materials escaped into the atmosphere, and the town had to be evacuated. About 100,000 people had to leave the area. Eventually they were able to make it so that nobody was seriously harmed or killed, and it only took about 2 weeks for that to happen, but it was a major nightmare, and eventually it's going to lead to the United States stopping the production of these types of nuclear facilities because people recognized the problems that they could possibly have. Unfortunately, there were other nuclear incidents in other parts of the world that weren't as harmless as the one at 3 Mile Island. The most famous one is in Ukraine in 1986 at a nuclear power plant called Chernobyl. At this power plant, there were 31 deaths after a nuclear explosion, and those 31 deaths is a number that's still disputed because some people say that the Soviet government wasn't very truthful in actually providing all of the evidence. Another part of the whole problem was that a lot of people were exposed to high amounts of radiation in the air, and this led to a lot of deformities, and they're still being accounted for. So a major disaster in Chernobyl, and this is also something in the back of people's minds about whether nuclear energy is a good alternative or not if something like this could happen. So even though it did happen in the Soviet Union during the 1980s, it was something that definitely weighed in on the minds of Americans as well. Also, something that happened during a lot of your lifetimes was in 2011, there was an earthquake in Japan as a result of a tsunami, and this led to the leakage of some radioactive materials in Japan as well, and caused a lot more problems. So these are some of the drawbacks of nuclear energy. The final slide is going to be about nuclear power in the United States today, and the map shows all of the nuclear power plants in the United States. There's 104 of them, and they're signified by these little red dots. So you can see that there's 2 that are in Ohio and 104 overall. No power plant's been built since 1974, and about 20% of the nation's electric power comes from these power plants. So the reason why 1974 is a significant year is because there were a lot of fears that came up after a lot of these plants were built about what happens if there is a meltdown. And like we talked about already, 3 Mile Island showed some of these fears, and what happened in the Soviet Union and in Japan also showed some of the possibilities with nuclear power plants. Also, like we talked about, there's 2 of them, of these plants, that are in Ohio. One of them is pretty close to where I grew up. I'm not positive, but I don't think it's the reason why I'm 6'9", but maybe some of this nuclear radiation got out and that had a small effect on that. Who knows? Hopefully these screencasts have been helpful to everybody. Again, make sure you're asking questions in class if there's something that doesn't make sense, and we'll clear anything up.